You seek peace. You crave quiet. But what if the silence you find isn't a balm, but a trap? What if the quaint, welcoming town you escape to has been waiting for you not as a guest, but as its next unwitting participant in a tradition far older and far more horrifying than you could ever imagine? Welcome to Oakhaven. Once you arrive, leaving isn't an option. And the true horror? It's not what they do to you, but what you discover about yourself.
I came to Oakhaven seeking an antidote to the city's relentless hum, a balm for the raw wound of my recent past. The online listing had promised rustic charm and unparalleled tranquility, and from the photos, Oakhaven looked like a postcard from a simpler time. Nestled deep within a valley, shrouded by an ancient, impenetrable forest, it seemed the perfect place to disappear, to mend. The drive itself was a descent into isolation. The highway thinned to a state road, then a county road, before finally dissolving into a single, winding ribbon of asphalt that snaked through a tunnel of towering pines. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the silence pressed in, a profound, almost physical presence. When I finally saw the weathered wooden sign, Oakhaven EST, 1888, it felt less like an arrival and more like an entry into a forgotten world. The town itself was a collection of clapboard houses, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin, gathered around a small, moss-covered church and a general store that looked as if it hadn't changed in a century. There were no streetlights, no bustling cafes, just the quiet hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of a hidden stream. My rental, a small two-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town, was exactly as advertised, quaint, a little dusty, and utterly silent. I spent the first few days unpacking, exploring the immediate surroundings, and trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that had clung to me like a second skin. The townspeople, few as they were surprisingly welcoming. Too welcoming, perhaps. Their smiles were wide, their eyes a little too eager, and they all seemed to know my name before I'd introduced myself. Mrs. Gable, who ran the general store, offered me a slice of her famous apple pie on my first visit, her gaze lingering a moment too long. Mr. Henderson, the taciturn postmaster, always had my mail ready before I even asked, a faint, knowing smirk playing on his lips. I tried to rationalize it. Small town, everyone knows everyone. News travels fast. But there was an undercurrent, a subtle dissonance that pricked at my unease. The way conversations would abruptly cease when I entered a room, only to resume in hushed tones once I'd passed. The way children, with their unnervingly bright eyes, would stop their play and simply stare as I walked by, their innocent faces holding an unsettling intensity. I'd catch glimpses of figures in windows, or at the edge of the dense forest that ringed the town, who would vanish the moment I turned my head. It was as if the entire town was a stage, and I, Elias Thorne, was the unwitting star of a play I didn't understand. The silence was the most pervasive element. Not the gentle quiet of nature, but a profound, almost unnatural stillness. The kind that makes your ears ring, that amplifies every rustle of leaves, every creak of my old cottage. At night, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, almost hypnotic chirping of crickets. Sometimes, though, a different sound would pierce the quiet, a low, guttural thrum from deep within the forest, like a distant, enormous heartbeat. I'd dismiss it as an animal, or perhaps the wind, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate to be either. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, a primal echo of something ancient and unsettling. I tried to connect with the outside world. My phone, a lifeline to my old life, was useless. No service, it stubbornly displayed, a constant reminder of my growing isolation. The internet, a luxury I hadn't truly appreciated until now, was equally elusive. I'd driven back to the main road a few times, just to get a signal, to check emails, to feel connected. Each time the drive felt longer, the road more winding, the forest more oppressive. It was as if Oakhaven was actively resisting my attempts to leave, pulling me back into its quiet embrace. One afternoon, while browsing the dusty shelves of the general store, I stumbled upon a collection of old photographs. They were faded, sepia-toned images of Oakhaven's past, generations of its inhabitants. What struck me was the uncanny resemblance between them. The same high cheekbones, the same piercing eyes, the same faint, almost imperceptible smiles. It was as if the town had been populated by clones, or perhaps by a single, unchanging family line. Mrs. Gable, noticing my interest, chuckled. "We're a close-knit community, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a little too sweet. "Always have been, keeps things pure." The word pure hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. My unease deepened. I started noticing patterns. A young man new to town, who had loudly complained about the lack of amenities, disappeared a few weeks after his arrival. Mrs. Gable simply shrugged when I asked. He decided Oakhaven wasn't for him, I suppose. But there was no suppose in her tone, only a quiet certainty. Then there was the old recluse, Mr. Finch, who had lived on the edge of town for decades, known for his eccentric rants about the old ways and the harvest. One morning his cottage was empty, his belongings gone. The townspeople offered no explanations, only averted eyes and a renewed emphasis on their traditions. I began to suspect that Oakhaven's tranquility was not natural, but carefully maintained. I started searching for answers, poring over old town records in the dusty, neglected town hall, a building that felt more like a mausoleum than a civic center. I found fragmented journals, their pages brittle with age, filled with cryptic entries about the cleansing, the culling, and the renewal. They spoke of cycles, of necessary sacrifices for the health of the community, of weeding out the unfit to ensure the purity of the bloodline. The language was archaic, veiled, but the implications were chilling. This wasn't about supernatural entities, it was about something far more insidious, far more human. The communal meals, once charming, now felt like rituals. Everyone ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, or occasionally on me. The children, those unnervingly bright-eyed children, would sing lullabies in a language I didn't understand, their voices a haunting, discordant chorus. I realized with a sickening lurch that the harvest wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, brutal practice, a dark secret woven into the very fabric of Oakhaven. And I, an outsider, a newcomer, was slowly being drawn into its terrifying embrace. I was being observed, assessed, and perhaps prepared. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The smiles, the quiet hospitality, the constant observation, it wasn't charm, it was surveillance. I wasn't a guest, I was a specimen under a microscope, being evaluated for a purpose I now understood with horrifying clarity. The unspecified personal loss that had driven me to Oakhaven, the one I had tried so desperately to outrun, suddenly felt less like a random tragedy and more like a carefully orchestrated event. Had they known? Had they somehow manipulated circumstances to bring me here, to this quiet, isolated valley? Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. I had to leave. Now. I packed a small bag, my hands trembling, stuffing in essentials, my mind racing. I tried my phone again, desperate for a signal, for any connection to the world beyond Oakhaven. Still nothing. The silence of the cottage, once a comfort, now felt like a shroud. I crept out, the night air cool and heavy, the stars overhead unnervingly bright in the absence of city lights. The single road out, the one I had driven in on, seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, a ribbon of black swallowed by the even deeper black of the forest. I walked, then ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sounds of my own footsteps echoing too loudly in the oppressive quiet. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I imagined eyes watching me from the shadows, the silent, knowing gazes of the townspeople. I pushed myself harder, my muscles screaming in protest, the image of those faded photographs, those identical faces, burning in my mind. They were all complicit. Every single one of them. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness. I felt a growing despair. The road, no matter how far I ran, seemed to lead nowhere. It twisted and turned, doubling back on itself, the landmarks I remembered from my drive inconspicuously absent. The forest, a dense, impenetrable wall on either side, seemed to press in, suffocating me. I was trapped. The realization was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I stumbled, exhausted, collapsing by the side of the road. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head to find a way out. When I opened them again, the first faint hint of dawn was painting the sky, a pale gray light filtering through the trees. And then I saw it. A small, hand-carved wooden sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It pointed back the way I had come. Welcome to Oakhaven. I had been running in a circle, trapped within the valley, within their silent, watchful embrace. The road hadn't led me out, it had merely led me back. I dragged myself back to my cottage, defeated, the rising sun casting long, mocking shadows. The town was waking up. Smoke curled from chimneys, a few figures moved about, tending to gardens, sweeping porches. They offered polite nods, their faces impassive, their eyes holding that familiar, unsettling knowingness. Mrs. Gable was already at the general store, arranging fresh produce. She smiled at me, a wide, almost pitying smile. "Rough night, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. Sometimes the quiet takes some getting used to. I said nothing, just walked past her, the weight of my failure pressing down on me. I knew now. I was not just being observed, I was being prepared. The harvest was coming, and I was to be its next offering. The horror wasn't just the act itself, but the chilling realization that I had walked willingly into my own cage, lured by the promise of peace, a peace that was nothing more than the silence of a tomb. The twisted end was not just my fate, but the insidious truth that my escape from one tragedy had led me directly into another, meticulously planned by those who smiled so sweetly. I spent the next few days in a haze of dread, the cottage feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a holding cell. The townspeople's smiles seemed wider, their gazes more intense, as if they were savoring the anticipation. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares of silent feasts and the rhythmic thrum I'd heard from the forest, now a constant, low vibration in my skull. One evening, a knock came at my door. It was Mrs. Gable, her face etched with a solemn, almost reverent expression. Behind her stood Mr. Henderson and a few other townsfolk, their eyes unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "the time has come. The harvest is tonight." I felt a jolt of pure terror, but it was quickly replaced by a strange, unsettling calm. I knew this was coming. I had walked into it, hadn't I? They led me not to the church, nor to any public building, but deep into the forest, along a path I had never seen before, despite my desperate attempts to navigate the woods. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the last vestiges of twilight. The air grew colder, and the thrumming sound intensified, vibrating through the very ground beneath my feet. I could hear the faint murmur of voices ahead, a low, chanting sound that sent shivers down my spine. We arrived at a clearing, bathed in the flickering light of dozens of torches. The entire town was there, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames, their eyes fixed on a central structure. It was a massive, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. And beneath it, a crude wooden platform. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was where it ended. As they led me towards the platform, a figure emerged from the shadows beneath the tree. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing. She held a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. She began to speak, her voice surprisingly strong, recounting the history of Oakhaven, of its founders, of the sacrifices made to ensure its prosperity. She spoke of the need for purity, for renewal, for the cyclical cleansing that kept their community strong. And then she spoke my name. Elias Thorne, son of Elias Thorne, descendant of the first seed of Oakhaven. I froze. Elias Thorne. My mother. She had died years ago, a quiet, unremarkable death in a city hospital. I had always believed it was a heart attack, a sudden, tragic end to a life lived in the shadows. But the old woman continued, her voice rising. "Your mother, Elias, she left us. She sought the false comforts of the outside world, but the blood of Oakhaven runs true. It calls its own back always. A wave of nausea washed over me. I remembered fragments, fleeting memories from my childhood. A strange, hushed conversation my mother had with an unfamiliar woman, her voice tight with fear. A small wooden bird, intricately carved, that my mother had kept hidden in a locked box. A bird that looked exactly like the one carved into the ancient oak tree before me. The personal tragedy I had fled, the one that had left me so vulnerable, so desperate for a new beginning, it wasn't an accident. It was a lure. A carefully constructed narrative to bring me back to Oakhaven, to fulfill a destiny I never knew I had. I wasn't an outsider. I was one of them. And the horror wasn't just that I was about to be harvested, but that I was being returned to the very source of my lineage, to be reabsorbed into the cycle I had unknowingly been born into. The twisted end wasn't my death, but the chilling realization that my entire life had been a carefully orchestrated journey back to a fate I could never escape, a fate woven into my very blood. I looked at the faces of the townspeople, no longer seeing strangers but distant relatives, their eyes holding the same unsettling knowingness, the same quiet acceptance of the inevitable. I was home, and home was a tomb.